Drag him up. You think wearing rags makes you invisible to the law? The officer sneered, pressing the black man's head against the cold ground. Tonight you're not going anywhere, unless your ID says Supreme Court. And then the man looked up, blood spreading beneath his left eye, and held out exactly that. The alley behind Dorchester's downtown was deserted, patrol car headlights sweeping over grimy, stained walls. At the base of a red brick wall, a black man lay on his side, blood on his left cheek, his worn, crumpled coat frayed at the seams as if he had just been in a scuffle. Logan Fry was the first to step out of the car. He walked up, shined his flashlight directly into the man's face, lips curling into a theatrical sneer. You picked the wrong place to play dead tonight, huh, buddy? His voice was dry, tinged with satisfaction, like he had just found something amusing to kill the boredom of the graveyard shift. Behind him, Darren Whitlow approached lazily, voice flat and uninterested. Get him up. Don't let blood drip into the trunk. No one asked the man his name, how he got hurt, or whether he needed medical help. They looked at him like misplaced garbage that needed clearing before the hotel next door opened in the morning. The man lifted his eyelids, staring upward without blinking. Blood welled along the bridge of his nose, trailing down to the corner of his mouth, but he didn't groan. Logan pushed the light closer, its beam reflecting off dark pupils, steady with a chilling calm. He showed no fear, didn't flinch, didn't try to explain. He looked at them like he was the one waiting for answers. I hope you've got the camera rolling, he said, voice raspy from cold air and dried blood in his throat, but clear. Logan paused, then burst out laughing, tucked a flashlight into his belt, grabbed the man's shoulder, and yanked him up roughly. What's this? Trying to star in your own victim story? Or is this your passive resistance stunt? Logan said while forcing him back upright against the wall. The wall was cold and rough behind him, but he didn't sway. Darren stood nearby, phone in hand, camera on, filming the bloodied face straight on. An unknown guy, a beard, a torn coat. Classic formula? You planning on going viral? Logan shoved his face close, breath reeking of cigarettes and arrogance. Who do you think you are? TV actor? A martyr for the cause? The man said nothing, eyes locked on the lens, each insult gliding past as if he didn't hear them. That calm rattled Logan more than any curse would have. I'm talking to you. Answer, or stay mute like the trash you are. I won't stay mute, the man said, but I will wait. Darren stopped recording. Wait for what? The man turned to Darren for the first time, his gaze neither warm nor cold. To see who's really leaving a mark on that video. Logan grabbed his collar and yanked hard, voice low with threat. I swear, one more word and you'll be live streaming from an ambulance. The man dropped his head, letting Logan grip him. Blood from his forehead dripping onto his collar, but his lips stayed tight, as if counting each second. Logan cuffed him, the click of metal loud in the empty alley. I love that a uniform can snap a black man's neck without needing a reason, he muttered, before slamming the man's head into the patrol car door. Darren climbed into the passenger seat, buckled up, while Logan took the wheel, opened TikTok, and flicked quickly through tracks looking for a catchy background song. In the back, the man was forced to sit cross-legged, blood from his mouth soaking into his collar. Logan muttered, "Call him a street artist, throw in a self-drawn ID." Darren laughed. Or how about homeless but with flair? The man spoke, not loud, not sharp, but his voice carried clearly inside the sealed cabin. I don't need flair, I have rights. Logan spat, flipped on the rear camera, and pointed it at the man. Filming a delusional preacher. Love it. The man didn't look away, staring straight into the lens. What are you proud of? Feeling strong or thinking I'm weak? Logan laughed, but the laugh was tight, slightly twisted. He didn't answer. The car stopped in front of the Dorchester station. Logan dragged the man out, didn't unlock the cuffs, just shoved him toward the entrance like tossing a sack. Darren signaled the officer at the desk. Another Nobe name. Note, resisting arrest. Unspecified disturbance, Logan added. And unstable mental state. The man was taken to the interrogation room. The room was cold, the fluorescent light pale, and the metal table colder than stone. Whitlow flipped open an empty file. Name, address, place of birth. The man looked around, then lifted his head and said slowly, word by word. You won't remember my name, but you'll never forget the consequences. Logan slammed his palm on the table. Don't start with the cryptic crap. I don't have time for lectures. The man stayed calm, reached into the edge of his inner shirt and pulled out a small object, jade green with a gold trim. He placed it gently on the table, right under the light. The card reflected bold capital letters, Supreme Court, Chief Justice, Ellis Monroe. The room went dead silent for a beat. Whitlow froze, his fingers lifting from the table. Logan stepped half a foot back, face drained, mouth open without sound. You are real? The man nodded, voice steady. I'm a judge, and tonight I'm living proof of what's rotting in this town. The door burst open. A security officer rushed in, panic on his face. The clip's out. Social media's exploding. There's a hashtag, Justice in Rags. Logan looked as if the blood had been drained from him. Stared at his phone, but didn't dare unlock the screen. Ellis Monroe remained seated, hand resting on the card. Eyes no longer those of a beaten man, but of someone ready to deliver judgment. No shouting, no threats. He had stepped into the game, and now the law was turning back on those who had misused its name. Logan tightened his grip on Ellis Monroe's wrist as the man stepped out of the patrol car. Before the cold night air could hit, Logan shoved him into the brick wall beside the station's front entrance. The sound of the shoulder slamming against stone echoed dry and heavy, but Ellis didn't make a sound. Logan leaned in close, voice damp with contempt and anger. Next time, shave before begging on the street. You look like an old dog counting trash people forgot. Ellis didn't respond immediately. He inhaled deeply, as if taking in the full chill of the wall behind him, then turned his head slightly, looked straight at Logan from close enough to hear him breathe. And you should learn to recognize the eyes of the innocent, he said, each word dropping like a stone, unwavering. Logan clenched his jaw, not from the insult but from the calm that made it feel like he was just repeating a scene the other man had seen too many times before. Next to them, Darren Whitlow leaned against a pillar, phone in hand, filming Logan overpowering Ellis. He didn't seem concerned about rules or consequences. He tilted his head, held the frame steady, and spoke like narrating a game show segment. One no-name, one beard, one torn coat. Predictable like the old formula. Logan gave a dry laugh, let go of Ellis's shoulder, but didn't step back. He spun Ellis around, locked both wrists tightly behind his back, then shoved him through the entrance. Welcome to the place where every drifter thinks he can rewrite the law, Logan said, driving a knee lightly behind Ellis's legs to make him buckle before dragging him forward. Ellis walked slowly but upright, offering no resistance, not needing to strain for balance. Whitlow followed behind, still filming. Swear to God, this guy's acting like he's the lead in a courtroom drama, he muttered, voice still soaked in mockery. At the interrogation room door, Logan stopped, pushed Ellis's shoulder against the stone wall, then turned to Darren. You send that to the group yet? Darren nodded. Still recording. Night shift's gonna love this in the morning. Ellis lifted his head and looked straight into the camera. No challenge. No avoidance, no performance of victimhood. He just looked, as if that gaze was the only response the spectacle deserved. Logan saw it, and it frustrated him more than silence or defiance. He stepped in, wedging his hand between Ellis's face and the camera lens, but the man didn't blink. Who do you think you are? An activist? A fallen icon? Or just some beggar who speaks English? Ellis drew a deep breath, slowly closed his eyes, tilting his head slightly left, as if listening to a distant tune. He opened them again and said, voice lower, You didn't guess wrong. You just got the wrong man. The words hit the two officers like a blow to the chest. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a declaration of power. It was simply a statement of truth, one they weren't ready to hear. Whitlow gave a dry laugh, but no longer looked into the camera. Logan clenched his jaw, waved a hand toward the room. Inside, tonight you're going to learn how we classify a parasite chewing on the law. They shoved him into the interrogation room, the metal door slamming shut behind. The room was lit in stark white, a cold iron table, 2 chairs, a ceiling mount recording device. Everything arranged for an investigation whose outcome had already been decided. Whitlow sat across from him. Logan leaned against the wall, arms folded. Full name? Ellis Monroe. Current address? Not relevant. Do you know where you are? On the line between a failed performance and a trial that hasn't begun? Logan leaned forward, voice low and harsh. Serious question. Who the hell are you? You talk like you're above the law. Ellis slowly placed his elbows on the table, hands resting calmly in front of his chest, eyes fixed on the white ceiling light. I'm not above the law. I am part of it, and tonight you've placed yourselves outside it. Logan didn't have time to respond before a staff member knocked and passed a file through the narrow slot. He snatched it, scanned quickly, then his face drained. Darren, he said, eyes glued to the first line. Check his name, now. Whitlow pulled out his phone, opened a search. 1 minute passed, then 2. He looked up, froze. Logan met his eyes, and for the first time that night felt a chill crawl down his spine. Ellis Monroe, Chief Justice, Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. The man sitting across from them, blood still dried at his temple, hands still cuffed, gaze still steady, was the one holding the highest balance of justice in the entire They hadn't just arrested the wrong person, they had offended the very root of what they claimed to uphold. Logan stepped back, hands falling to his sides. Whitlow began to breathe heavily, sweat beating at his temple. Ellis looked at them, expression flat. He gave a small nod and said, "And now, I'll say it one last time, I hope your camera was rolling." No one answered. No one had the words. For a moment, the room was no longer an interrogation room. It was a mirror, where justice turned back on those wearing its badge. Logan placed a hand on the chair, but couldn't sit anymore. He had lost that posture. Whitlow shut off his phone, no longer filming. The performance was over. The truth had started recording. In the patrol car, speeding through streets bathed in sodium light, Ellis Monroe was pressed against the rear window, his wrists cuffed tightly, blood from the wound on his forehead still trickling with each bump the tires hit on the uneven road. Logan Fry sat in the driver's seat, one hand on the wheel, the other swiping through his phone like he was choosing music for a party. He gave a quiet chuckle, quickly scrubbing through the freshly recorded video, adding a caption under the clip showing Ellis pinned to the wall in bright steel restraints. "Friday night with a street artist and a self-made ID?" Logan repeated the caption, added background music, then laughed aloud, like he had just found a new game more entertaining than any criminal he'd ever caught. Darren Whitlow sat beside him, silent, eyes occasionally flicking to the rearview mirror to watch Ellis leaning his head against the seat, his expression unchanged since walking into the station. Logan tilted his head, gripped the phone, and turned the front camera on himself, muttering, "Tonight, I'm going viral. This one's going on the entertainment page." The air inside the car was heavy, not just with Ellis's silence, but also with the artificial cheer of the video replaying a scene that should never have happened. Ellis looked out through the fogged-up window, lights from signs streaking across his face in smudged lines. He turned and spoke, voice low and clear. "What are you celebrating? That you feel strong, or that you think I'm weak?" Logan didn't turn around, still staring at the screen, but his eyes twitched slightly. He cleared his throat, leaned back in his seat, and let out a long laugh, a laugh that failed to hide its edge. "I'm celebrating that a uniform can break a black man's neck without needing a reason?" The words hit like a slap, echoing in the car, where there was no radio, no sirens, no noise to dull their weight. Ellis turned his face to the right, staring into the dark, the same dark he had spent decades fighting from the highest bench to shield justice from words like those. But he didn't answer with outrage, didn't snap back to escalate. That silence, though he never admitted it, was what began to drain something from Logan's high. The car pulled into the Dorchester station lot. Logan cut the engine, slipped the phone into his pocket, but didn't lose the smirk. "Let's see, Judge. Tonight you get the VIP seat." He opened the back door, grabbed Ellis by the arm with just enough force to show control without tipping into brutality. Whitlow opened the passenger door, stood upright, hands in pockets, watching like someone attending a show. The three of them entered the intake area. A young officer glanced up at the file just printed. Name, condition, photo ID. Ellis was taken to the photo station, flash snapping across his bloodied face and the coat frayed at every seam. The officer glanced down at the image, said nothing, but it was clear he noticed something off. Not fear, not rage, but a kind of strange resolve, so firm it made the picture look like it came from a higher office entirely. When Ellis was placed in a small isolation room awaiting processing, Logan leaned toward Darren and whispered, "I'm thinking of using this clip as the intro for our internal training. Title, Quick ID, Swift Control." Darren didn't laugh, just shrugged. "Up to you, but I think we should run a deeper check on him." Logan raised an eyebrow. "Already did, nothing. No ID, no insurance card, no papers, no criminal record. Empty." Darren crossed his arms, eyes sharpening. "That's what makes it dangerous. Someone that clean is either invisible or hiding something big." Logan waved it off, trying to act unbothered, but there was a shift in his expression, like, for the first time, he doubted his own ability to read a target. Inside the isolation room, Ellis sat upright on the metal bench. His hands rested on his thighs, eyes fixed on the gray wall in front of him. Nothing in that room belonged to power, yet he didn't look like someone who'd had power taken away. Through the frosted glass on the door, a guard watched and took notes. Male, black, no resistance, visible injury, no signs of psychological disturbance. A supervisor walking past glanced at the record and asked, "Any additional notes?" The young officer hesitated for a second, then added a final line. "Doesn't seem ordinary." No one knew why he wrote that. It wasn't the title. He had no idea who the man was. It was just something in his eyes that demanded to be written down, even when there was no name for it. Meanwhile, Logan was logging into the internal group chat. He uploaded the video with the caption, "Friday night script, laugh or cry." Within a minute, emojis started popping up. But 10 minutes later, another message appeared in the thread. "Who's the guy in this? Looks like that chief or something? Think I saw him in the state justice broadcast." Logan frowned, scrolled back through the footage. This time, his face lost the smirk. He flipped through the original printed file, cross-checking a few entries. Then, as if a current ran up his spine, he typed into search, Ellis Monroe. The screen loaded. A portrait photo, credentials, and a video clip from a statewide conference 2 years ago. There he was, in a black robe, standing before the flag of justice, speaking in a steady, resonant voice without a script. When the law becomes a shield for privilege, it is no longer law, it is a weapon. Logan pulled his hands away from the keyboard, his eyes blank for a few seconds. He stood, walked toward the isolation room, hands cold with sweat. Darren met him in the hallway, face pale. "You know now?" Logan didn't answer, just nodded. Ellis Monroe, Chief Justice. This was no longer an internal matter, no longer a game, and the handcuffs around that man's wrists at this moment looked like evidence tightening around the necks of those who thought they had the right to put them there. The interrogation room sat at the end of the hallway, gray iron door chipped at the edges, the fluorescent light above clicking softly, as if even the wiring hesitated before what was about to unfold. Ellis Monroe was shoved inside, his back hitting the edge of the icy metal chair, cuffed hands landing heavily on the scratched steel table. Logan Fry stood to the side, clutching a freshly printed file, tension in his eyes barely masked by the way he bit his lower lip. Darren Whitlow sat across from Ellis, taking on his usual interrogator tone, trying to reassert his role as the one holding authority in the room. "Name?" he asked flatly, without emotion. "Address? Record?" Ellis sat upright, not leaning forward, not glancing at the ceiling mount camera. He answered, firmly and slowly, "You won't remember my name, but you'll never forget the consequence." For a second, the air in the room thickened like someone had sliced through a circuit. Darren set his pen down, his hand pausing slightly on the table. Logan snapped the folder from under his arm and slapped it hard against the metal surface, the sound sharp and jarring. "He's pulling the human rights card now," he shouted. Not because Ellis had said anything wrong, but because his answer didn't fit into any script they were used to handling. Logan shoved the photo report toward Darren's face, like searching for backup. But Darren glanced once, then silently folded it closed. Ellis lowered his head, raised his right hand slowly, and slid it into the worn layers of his coat. Every motion was deliberate, unhurried, as if each step was part of a process already set in motion, needing no justification. He pulled out a small rectangular object, gold-edged and glinting under the white light, and placed it on the table in front of him. The card flipped over, displaying clearly printed words: Supreme Court, Chief Justice, Ellis Monroe. Time froze. Darren stared at the lettering, his throat dry. Logan stepped half a pace back, fingers gripping the edge of the table, his body drained of energy. Neither man moved, not because they had never seen a badge of power, but because they had never imagined that the man they pinned against a wall, dragged like social trash, carried the highest legal authority in the state. Ellis sat still, hands resting near the card, his face showing no pride, no triumph. He didn't need to say anything. The presence of the card alone dismantled the entire order they believed they were controlling. Darren swallowed hard, leaned in to examine it again, trying to rule out the possibility of fraud. But every detail, each golden edge, each precisely engraved letter, every embedded security mark, confirmed what could no longer be denied. Logan lowered his eyes, turned away, then instinctively pulled out his phone. Not to record, he didn't dare anymore, just to check if anyone in the internal group had realized what they were caught up in. A message popped up from the department's internal communications center. Someone's asking about tonight's arrest footage. The video is spreading. Source of the leak unknown. Logan froze, eyes locked on the message, then turned to Darren. Damn it, the first clip's already out. Darren frowned, pulled out his phone to check. Meanwhile, Ellis remained still, unmoving, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, the moment when all surrounding noise had to stop and make room for the only thing that still held weight, the truth. Darren set his phone down, his voice hoarse. This can't be real. No way he's here, looking like this. Logan was breathing hard now, not searching for a fix, just an exit. We need to call it in. Bring this up immediately. Ellis tilted his head, eyes steady on both of them, voice even and low. You don't need to call anyone. You already called the entire system here yourselves. He pointed to the camera, still recording above. Your camera is still rolling, and this time I think it's recording the right subject. Darren looked up, then down at the control panel. The red light was still blinking. Ellis went on. I don't need a warning. I'm not here for compensation. I'm here to witness. Logan cut in sharply. Witness what? Why are you even here? Ellis exhaled, the kind of breath that carried the weight of too many disappointments in a life spent with the law. I'm here to see how many of you believe that someone like me could never sit in the chair I hold. Silence returned to the room. It wasn't the kind of silence Logan and Darren knew from their usual shifts. Not the pause before a false confession, not the gap in a dead-end interview. It was the silence of a courtroom preparing to judge itself. No mediators, no hearings. Darren stood and backed toward the door. Logan pulled the key from his pocket, ready to unlock the cuffs, but Ellis lifted a hand to stop him. I don't want to be freed by someone who doesn't believe he cuffed the wrong man. Darren blocked the door, his voice unsteady. We'll report this, just stay here. Someone from higher up will take over. Ellis didn't smile. Monroe didn't mock. He simply said, I don't need anyone to take over. I just need you to understand that you acted wrong. Logan walked out of the room like someone fleeing an explosion. Darren was the last to remain, glancing one more time at the badge still resting on the table, like a marker between the present and whatever collapse was coming. The door closed. Inside, the camera kept rolling. Ellis stayed seated, back straight, eyes half closed. No one knew what he was thinking, but it was clear he hadn't come to be pardoned. He had come to prove that justice doesn't need to shout to be seen, and the price of contempt, sometimes, is being forced to listen all the way through. The interrogation room had never been this quiet. The overhead light still shone directly onto the table, reflecting off the metallic badge resting silently between fingers hardened by years of service and duty. But no one looked at the light. Both Darren Whitlow and Logan Fry kept their eyes fixed on the bold etched letters. Supreme Court, Chief Justice Ellis Monroe. Each word landed like a shard of glass on the arrogance they had worn like armor, slicing through layers of confidence built up over the years on the job. Whitlow gripped his pen, but his fingers trembled so much that the pen tip dragged a smudge of ink across the table. He no longer sat upright. His back curled as if the weight of that title was pressing down on his spine, pushing each vertebra closer to the floor. Logan was different. He stepped back half a pace, as if instinctively trying to create distance between himself and the name that had just surfaced. His mouth opened, voice dry and broken like a confession in a storm. You're real? Ellis Monroe didn't move his hands, didn't lift the badge from the table. He just nodded, not dramatically, not for effect. "I'm a judge," he said, his voice no louder than conversation, but solid as stone. "And tonight, I am the evidence against you." The air in the room tightened instantly, as if the words weren't only directed at the two men in front of him, but at the entire system they represented. Ellis didn't raise his tone, didn't glare, but his stare left no space for doubt. It was the way a person speaks when they know they don't have to shout to be heard, and it was the moment the listener realizes they've crossed a line that should never be touched. The door burst open with the force of panic. A night shift officer rushed in, eyes wide, phone in hand, screen still lit. His voice shook with urgency, trying to keep itself steady. "The clip leaked! It's everywhere!" Both Darren and Logan turned sharply. The officer hurried forward, held out the phone. The video was playing, the shot of Logan slamming Ellis against the alley wall, mixed with sneering laughter and the line, "Next time shave before begging on the street." Below, a flood of reactions scrolled by in real time. "He looks familiar. Is that Monroe? That cop's laughing while assaulting him. Sick. Supreme Court, you guys messed with the wrong man. Is this a movie or real life? The police just roughed up the Chief Justice." Logan snatched the phone out of the officer's hand, shut off the screen, and slammed it onto the table. The impact knocked the Supreme Court badge slightly off angle, its reflection flashing once more in his eyes like a warning that couldn't be ignored. He turned back to Ellis, but the control in his gaze was gone. "Who leaked this?" he growled. The officer stammered. "Unknown, maybe from the internal server. Social media's picking it up. The hashtag's trending." Whitlow breathed heavily, sweat lining his back. He knew exactly what that meant. Once the footage left the building, control no longer belonged to anyone inside these four walls. Ellis calmly returned the badge to his chest pocket, the motion not rushed but firm, like closing a chapter. He stood up without waiting for permission, hands still cuffed, back straight as if he had never bowed to anyone. "I don't think I need to stay here another minute," he said, then glanced at the young officer. "Call an ambulance. The blood has soaked through my collar." The officer nodded, almost on reflex. Darren remained frozen, as if he hadn't yet processed that the order in his mind was collapsing with every new share of the video. Logan stood motionless, mouth open, ready to argue but unable to speak. Ellis looked at him one last time before turning to the door. "You know what's scarier than a badge?" he asked, not waiting for a reply. "It's when it doesn't have to be shown for people to change how they see you." Logan lowered his head, not out of fear, but because he knew the power game he once controlled had shifted sides. Not with guns, not with politics, but with the one thing he had always dismissed, the resolve of someone underestimated. When the interrogation room door closed behind Ellis, the air no longer belonged to an investigation. It was the aftermath of a failed arrest, a warning written in blood and captured on camera, and a silence that had killed the belief that a police badge held ultimate authority in every situation. That night, Dorchester didn't just lose its quiet. It lost the illusion that justice wouldn't turn around and stare directly at those misusing its name. From the moment Ellis Monroe walked out of that room, the world outside no longer called him by his title. It called him something no one could take away, a living witness to a system now being exposed from within. 4 hours after Ellis Monroe left the interrogation room, The 42K video officially passed 2 million views. It needed no narration, no clickbait title, no pounding soundtrack. A black man in a torn coat, his blood pressed to concrete, face expressionless, eyes locked onto a blinding flashlight. The clip froze at the moment he pulled a green card with gold trim from his coat and held it toward the camera. Almost simultaneously, the laughter in the background halted. A strange silence stretched across the rest of the footage. No explanation, no text, but the internet didn't need more context. Within 10 minutes, the hashtag Ellis Monroe appeared on Twitter. 20 minutes later, Justice in Rags reached the top 3 trending topics nationwide. Screenshots of the badge moment were brightened, sharpened, and colored in red. Side angles of Ellis's bloodied face were turned into stickers, spreading across Instagram. A verified account reposted the clip with a short caption, "If a judge gets treated like a dog, what does that make us?" That line was retweeted tens of thousands of times in half an hour, showing up in student stories, journalist feeds, and even among young politicians still too cautious to speak out publicly. Some began pairing 2 photos, one of Ellis Monroe in a black robe at last year's state conference, speaking in his calm tone, the other of him with blood on his cheek, face forced against damp pavement under flashing police lights. The reaction spread like wildfire in a drought-stricken forest. On legal forums, young attorneys began reposting the clip with commentary. This isn't just an assault, this is a denial of the very existence of the one holding the highest seat of justice. The official account of the National Police Conduct Oversight Organization posted a statement. "We demand an independent investigation into the arrest of Justice Monroe. This is no longer an internal matter. We are taking measures to bring our patron and justice system into alignment." The official account of the National Police Conduct Oversight Organization posted the post was under 10 lines, but cited everywhere as an urgent call to action. The media could no longer remain distant. News outlets moved the clip to the top of their segments. From CNN to local broadcasts, the message echoed. Ellis Monroe doesn't need defending for his title. He needs to be protected for the truth visible in that footage. In Dorchester, in his darkened apartment, Logan Fry sat hunched over a computer screen, browser windows filled with links, all pointing to the same video. He had tried deleting his TikTok, his Instagram, even the internal messaging app, but the backups kept spreading. Copies showed up on Reddit, then Telegram, then Facebook, in every format. Original, crop, set to music, overlaid with commentary. Logan had once believed that deleting fast enough could stop it, but he had forgotten. People weren't watching this video for entertainment. They were watching it because it revealed exactly what many had feared was buried deep in the system, a belief crushed under the knee of power. His phone kept ringing. Unknown numbers, then coworkers. No one was calling to check in. Only one message came from his superior. "Shut off your phone. Do not appear. This is being handled internally." Logan threw the phone onto the table, covered his face with his hand, and cold sweat poured out, even with the door locked and curtains drawn. He used to believe that a police badge was a shield against all risks, but now he realized no shield was thick enough to stop a truth being shared thousands of times every minute. That green card with gold trim, in silence and blood, was cutting through every illusion he had carried throughout his years in the force. At universities, law students held emergency forums. They didn't wait for official approval. A blown-up photo of Ellis was pinned to the board beside the quote, "I am the evidence against you." Some students started using Justice in Rags as the theme for final papers, or the title of podcasts critiquing the legal system. One female student stood up in the auditorium, voice shaking. "If he hadn't shown the badge, would he still be alive? And if it were my father or my brother, what could they show to keep from being pinned to the ground?" No one answered. The question echoed through captions that followed, like a warning waiting to ignite if the system didn't stop itself in time. Ellis Monroe remained silent. All afternoon he gave no statements. The Supreme Judicial Office declined to speak with me the dia, only confirming, Justice Monroe has returned home. He is fit to work and has not requested medical attention. But in a leaked clip later, Ellis was seen exiting his front door with his right hand bandaged, his gaze steady. No bowing of the head, no wave. A nearby boy raised a phone to take a photo, but Ellis only smiled and said softly, "Don't save my face. Remember what they said." In that moment, the public began to understand this wasn't about a victim being recognized. It began with a man in power, and that power hadn't kept him from bleeding. In a suburban cafe, a group argued fiercely about the video. A middle-aged man in a work suit slammed the table. "Even judges get beaten? Then what are we, garbage?" An older woman nodded, her hands trembling around a glass of water. "I never trust videos online, but this one doesn't need explaining." Something was shifting in public perception. The incident no longer revolved around Ellis Monroe. It had become a mirror reflecting how people assign worth based on surface. A torn coat, a thick beard, a darker skin. As night fell over Dorchester, every street stayed lit as usual. But inside countless homes, phones played the same image. And at the center of that frame, a man sat on the pavement, blood on his face, eyes open, holding out a badge. Among hundreds of entertainment clips, that video stayed quietly near the top of the most viewed, not because of algorithms, but because it said the one thing millions had long suspected but never dared to believe. If justice wears rags, will we still recognize it? And if someone like Ellis Monroe has to prove his identity not to be strangled, then how will those without badges stay alive? The morning after the video went viral, the office of the governor of Massachusetts shifted from routine meetings to internal emergency mode. The assembly was marked absolute priority, with mandatory attendance from representatives of the Department of Justice, State Police, Public Communications, and Human Rights. In the high-ceilinged room, flooded with white light, no one sat properly. A meeting meant to contain a fire had quickly become a session held atop a powder keg. The first to speak was Governor Eleanor Carver, her voice hoarse after 15 hours of nonstop updates. "We can't bury this. The name Ellis Monroe is too big, and the image of him, bloodied, holding a Supreme Court badge, is now in the hands of children all the way out west." The sentence made everyone flipping through files freeze. No one argued, no one suggested a fix. Every news segment replayed felt like a fresh cut into the reputation of the system they represented. Outside the Dorchester police station, protest signs began to appear. Not loud, not chanted. An older man set a wooden board at the gate, bold words carved without flair. "Uniforms kill justice." He didn't speak, didn't hold a megaphone, didn't live stream. He simply stood there, like someone laying the first stone on the grave of the illusion that police are always right. The sign wasn't taken down. Officers on duty looked at it and turned away, because if anyone dared to remove it, they would have to face a rage that was no longer waiting for permission to ignite. In another city 300 miles away, during a live-streamed children's program, an unscripted moment left the room silent. A girl around 10 raised her hand after a storytelling segment called "What is a Judge?" When invited, she stood, both hands gripping the microphone, and asked directly into the camera, "If they beat up a judge, then who's going to protect me?" The host paused, lowering her head. The question needed no answer. It was clipped and shared instantly. Hundreds began using that question in their Facebook bios. The press called it the question that cracked the wall of silence. Ellis Monroe declined every interview request. He made no media appearances, no public statements, and didn't show up in court or hospitals. His absence only heightened the tension, pulled public attention tight like a drawn string. Speculation swirled. Had he resigned? Would he sue? Was he retreating from the very system he had once served? While debates chased assumptions, a tweet appeared from Ellis's verified account. Just 8 words, no photo, no video. "My silence does not mean my forgiveness." No emojis, no exclamation point. Yet it hit harder than any broadcast interview. His Twitter account, once reserved for sharing court rulings and legal statements, had suddenly become the center of public emotion. Lawyers reposted his 8 words, calling them a voice that doesn't need to be loud. Some Instagram users designed graphics with the quote on a black background, sharing it like a quiet declaration. Within police forums, internal cracks began to show. Some veteran officers called for an independent investigation to determine who betrayed the badge, while others tried to stay silent and wait for the storm to pass. But this time, the storm didn't pass. It became a trail of blood, traced from a single clip into a wave of questions, into pressure that forced the system to look at itself. At the state law office, a draft resolution was introduced, proposing the creation of a real-time police conduct oversight committee. Young politicians began speaking to the press with a different tone. No more deflection. No more, "we're reviewing." They spoke of an unacceptable mistake. They named the truth that Ellis Monroe's torn coat had convinced officers he couldn't possibly carry a badge of authority. This was no longer just a violent incident. It had become a flashpoint for the public to see the thin line between power and prejudice. In a high school classroom, a sociology teacher played the video before starting her lesson. She didn't comment, but as the students watched the moment Ellis held up the badge, through blood and flashing lights, one spoke. "I think if he were white, the police would have asked his name before pushing his face into the ground." No one disagreed. The class nodded, and in that moment, no textbook or lecture outline was needed. The lesson had been taught. Outside Massachusetts, other states began to speak up. Several judges released public letters demanding the protection of every person's inviolable rights, regardless of status or appearance. They cited the Ellis Monroe case as evidence of weak oversight within law enforcement. But one thing no one dared to say aloud lingered beneath it all. If it hadn't been Ellis, if it had just been an unnamed homeless man, would the video have gone this far? That question hung like a blade over the public's mind. The truth was, it was precisely because he was the Chief Justice, because he held that badge of power, that the outrage swelled to this scale. But for the thousands without badges, without titles, without voices, who would listen when wrongful arrests happened to them? Ellis didn't answer. He remained silent. But that tweet, those 8 quiet words, kept getting printed, shared, and repeated across every corner of the internet, like a reminder that this silence, this time, was the loudest sound the system had ever heard. And even as a whole state tried to look away, the truth slipped through every crack, straight into the public eye, like a light no denial could extinguish. On the 3rd day after the incident, a second video began spreading rapidly. This time, not from bystanders, not from outside sources, but from within the Dorchester Police Department itself. In the clip, a man's voice is heard, laughing while pointing the camera at the man pinned to the ground. "Send this to the group. We've got tonight's entertainment." No face is clearly visible, just a voice, but those in the profession recognized it instantly. Greg Halter, the 3rd officer present that night. Not the one who hit, not the one who gave orders, but the one who recorded the entire event and shared it in the police's private group chat for fun. Greg wasn't just the one filming, he also captioned the video before sending it. With a beard like that, he must be a wandering actor. The Dorchester police chief had no choice but to open an official investigation. The state's Department of Justice demanded full cooperation, and this time, the public didn't wait. Protest signs changed their message. From "Uniforms kill justice" to "One records, the other is remembered." Outrage no longer targeted just the violence, but the very mechanism that normalized turning victims into entertainment. Within 24 hours, Halter was summoned, and both Logan Fry and Darren Whitlow were placed on temporary suspension for involvement in a state-level ethics investigation. The suspension didn't calm public anger, but at least it marked the first step of a system being forced to examine itself. In the middle of the chaos, a local television station aired a live interview with Logan Fry. The same man who once mocked with confidence on video now sat under studio lights, clean-shaven, wearing a plain dress shirt. eyes red. The host didn't need to push. Logan nearly broke down on the first question. He looked down, hands clenched, then blurted out something no one expected. "I didn't know who he was." The camera caught his sweat-drenched face, his voice cracking mid-sentence. The host paused for a few seconds, then repeated slowly, "So if you had known he was a judge, you wouldn't have done it?" Logan didn't answer. His lips trembled, but his throat gave out. Social media erupted. A well-known account reposted the clip with the comment, "Because he was black, you didn't bother to know." Underneath, replies flooded in. One user wrote, "I don't need you to know who he was. I just need you to know he was a person." Another shared the interview, rewound to the moment Logan stepped back after hearing the name Ellis Monroe, then edited it side by side with his breakdown on camera. The caption read, "When the badge becomes a mirror." Though the interview ended with an apology, it had no soothing effect. Logan wasn't seen as someone who made a mistake. He was seen as the face of something larger, the arrogance of invisible privilege. From the state attorney's office, the official spokesperson confirmed that the investigation was expanding. It is no longer focused solely on 3 individuals. The entire night shift unit, the person who approved intake without verifying identity, the officer responsible for reviewing surveillance who failed to flag irregularities, all were added to the accountability review list. Police department ethics boards were convened continuously, some in closed-door sessions with civilians affected by similar wrongful arrests. Ellis Monroe remained silent, but his silence was no longer an absence. It had become an echo, shaped by the community's response. In a media studies class at New England University, the instructor led an analysis of how the second video spread. The room went quiet as the clip replayed the moment Greg Halter laughed. A student stood up and asked, "Why is that laugh more disturbing than the violence itself?" That question was widely shared and later cited in a feature article by a veteran journalist in The Atlantic. "Violence may be a moment. Laughter means it was normalized." That sentence opened a series of deep-dive reports on internal police culture, where misconduct was not just an excuse but often celebrated in private circles. Under growing public pressure, some officers began requesting temporary reassignment. They didn't resign, but asked to be moved to backline duty until public attention settled. The event was no longer about Halter, Whitlow, or Logan. It had become a test of trust for the entire institution. A local paper ran the headline, "The Price of a Laugh." The headline wasn't aimed solely at Greg Halter. It targeted everyone who had laughed without realizing they were being recorded. And through that current, people began to see. The camera in Halter's hand hadn't betrayed him. It had simply captured what the system allowed. Ellis Monroe still did not appear, but with every replay of him presenting his badge through blood, every instance of Greg Halter's laugh layered over the violence, and every shot of Logan's bowed head on national TV, one truth became clearer than any written law. Power isn't defined by the one holding the cuffs, but by how society chooses to respond to injustice. And this time, society wasn't silent, because this time, justice had a face marked by blood, but not submission, a face caught on camera, and one that would not be forgotten. Just 2 days after the controversial interview, social media was shaken again by a resurfaced video from a security camera in South Dorchester, 3 blocks from the site of the Ellis Monroe incident. The footage, dated 3 weeks earlier, showed Logan Fry pinning a young black man to the hood of a police cruiser in front of 2 bystanders. The young man's hands were scraped. His voice shouted in protest, "I was just waiting for the bus. I have my papers." Logan ignored him, eyes cold, tightening the cuffs around the man's wrists. The video also captured Logan rifling through the man's wallet, tossing his ID to the ground without looking. Seconds later, he looked up and said flatly into his radio, "Another one pretending to be innocent. Take him in for screening." A line once forgotten, now echoed online like another blow to the already shredded dignity of the Dorchester Police Department. The victim was quickly identified. Jamal Briggs, 26 years old, a final-year medical student with a fractured rib and shoulder injury from the wrongful arrest. He remained in the hospital recovering from internal surgery due to blunt force trauma. His family had never received an apology, and their official complaint had been referred to another department in silence. But once the video spread, Jamal's name began circulating alongside Ellis's. Two sharp points of a truth now undeniable, that abuse of power wasn't an accident, but a pattern. Public anger doubled. Logan Fry was no longer seen as one man's failure, but as a link in a chain of authority that had slept too long on unchecked control. A veteran columnist for the Boston Globe wrote bluntly, "We're not watching this video to be angry. We're watching it to ask, how many people have been buried beneath handcuffs that seemed legal?" Meanwhile, an image of Ellis Monroe at his swearing-in ceremony was published across major news outlets. He stood beside the Massachusetts Attorney General, robed in black, one hand on the Constitution, eyes steady and unblinking. A once archived photo had become the stark contrast to the video of him bloodied, cuffed, and forced to the ground. Two frames, one captured in honor, one in humiliation, now sat side by side, producing a breathless reckoning. The public was confronted with a simple but painful question. How many times have we seen the title but not the person? And how many times the opposite? News networks that once avoided political reporting have now begun full coverage. Evening broadcasts no longer opened with weather or traffic, but with social analysis on power, prejudice, and the structures embedded within law enforcement. At the State Human Rights Council, a member tapped their fingers on the table during a closed-door meeting, voice hoarse like someone who hadn't slept. "I think it's time we stop pretending everything is fine. When a man in rags has to flash a badge just to be seen as human, it's clear the system has fallen asleep." The quote was cited in multiple editorials afterward as a wake-up call. It spread to civil society organizations, student forums, and legal centers. People no longer divided themselves into pro- or anti-police factions. They divided along one question: who is truly awake and who is still lulling themselves with lines like, "The victim must have done something wrong," or "Cops don't have time to pick on decent people." That question simmered through classrooms, news segments, and social media posts. It forced the silent to open their eyes, and in that light, Ellis Monroe didn't need to say more. He had spoken enough just by being in the right place at the right time, in a form society once deemed invisible. Those who once dismissed him now saw themselves through him, not in remorse, but in fear that when the truth shows itself, it doesn't knock. It enters the room, and once it's in, no one gets to look away. What once slept has now awakened, and those who dozed through it must open their eyes, not to witness a bizarre event, but to see that the verdict on apathy is already being written. Read the Wonder Years offers a tasty beatitude. One day after the media published the image of Ellis Monroe taking his oath beside the Attorney General, public response continued to surge beyond the usual news cycle. At a panel at Harvard Law School, Professor Louis Farley, known for his unflinching critiques of the American legal system, addressed a room packed with students, journalists, and senior faculty. The highest title didn't protect him, but he is protecting the dignity of that title. The words landed like a clean break between rank and worth. In that moment, people realized Ellis Monroe wasn't simply the victim of an act of violence. He was preserving the shape and soul of the very institution people were beginning to doubt: law, justice, and the integrity of those sworn to uphold it. Through blood and composure, he made sure the seat he held didn't sit empty, didn't serve as a shield for unchecked power, but became something else entirely, the last place a citizen can cling to when everything else collapses. On the streets of Dorchester that morning, a group of high school students gathered in front of the city police headquarters. No chants, no drums, just handwritten signs held silently in the air. One line made passers-by stop and take a closer look. "Power is blind, but justice has memory." The sign was plain, not colorful, just a white board with slanted black marker ink. But it struck a nerve. No matter how arbitrary the system of power might act, the memory of when it acted wrongly would not disappear. The crowd behind the sign didn't shout, they simply stood, face to face with the curtained windows inside. They weren't waiting for answers. Their presence was the question, and every uniform behind the glass could hear it loud and clear. A local photojournalist captured that moment, and the image spread quickly across social media. In the photo, a girl about 15, hair tied up, face firm, held a sign with that quote, surrounded by her peers, each one holding a different message. Justice doesn't need a badge, justice needs eyes. If he's a judge, then who am I? We remember. No one needed a slogan list. Each wrote their own question from a place of fear and awareness. In that spontaneity, gave the moment its weight, because it wasn't fueled by passing anger, but by the understanding that power may be blind, but those it trampled do not forget. Inside the Internal Communications Office of the State Police, a team of specialists reviewed every frame from the 3 leaked videos, not to analyze technical issues, but to pinpoint when exactly the public crossed the line of tolerance. One person pointed to the moment Logan bowed his head during the interview, another to look in Ellis's eyes as his face was forced into the wall. But then a young intern raised her hand and pointed to the students holding their signs. I think this was when people realized there's no taking any of it back. Silence filled the room. Everyone knew what scares the system isn't investigations, it's the spread of awareness. That evening, in a small church on the far east side of the city, an unofficial prayer vigil took place. No priest, no speakers, no stage, just people quietly gathering, bringing candles, notes, handwritten scraps of paper. A white woman stood beside an Asian man, across from a Latino boy and an elderly black veteran. None of them knew each other, but they had come for one name: Ellis Monroe. The man who led the group, dressed in plain clothes, said just one sentence before falling silent. Tonight, we don't pray for a man. Tonight, we pray that awareness doesn't come too late. And for the rest of the night, in flickering candlelight, those who had once stayed silent now faced the truth. When a system loses its way, the one who protects its worth might be the very one it tried to break. But from that point on, history would begin rewriting itself, not by the power of those with titles, but by the memory of those once disregarded. And they would not forget, not ever. 3 days after the 3rd video went viral and the entire state sank into a wave of public scrutiny, the Dorchester Police Department was forced to hold a press conference under pressure from the media, the city council, and thousands of messages from residents. The conference was hastily announced in the late afternoon, set in the main briefing room with chairs lined against the walls, TV cameras aimed at the podium, and microphones stacked in rows. At the table sat only a spokesperson for the department, with the large Dorchester police emblem behind him and an empty row of chairs to the left, where Darren Whitlow and Logan Fry were supposed to sit. When asked about their absence, the spokesperson replied tersely, "Officer Whitlow has declined to comment. Officer Fry is currently in media isolation, as per legal advice." The response did nothing to ease the wave of questioning and, in fact, fueled even more outrage. One journalist pressed, "They can decline to speak to the media, but can they decline accountability?" The spokesperson looked down at his notes and gave no reply, instead launching into a prepared statement that read in part, "We are seriously reviewing all field conduct protocols and are committed to not tolerating any breach of departmental ethical standards." What was expected to be a hollow press event took a sharp turn with the unexpected appearance of social activist Marla DeWitt, known for her live-streamed critiques of police misconduct in major cities. She stood from the audience and requested to speak, unscripted. She didn't raise her voice or show anger, but her words were as sharp as ice. "I have just one question I want everyone here and everyone watching live to ask themselves. If that night Ellis Monroe hadn't pulled out his Supreme Court ID, would he still be alive for us to sit here and talk about ethics today?" The room fell silent, not from a lack of answers, but because everyone knew no one would dare answer honestly. A few cameras shifted toward the podium. Some tried to divert the conversation to reviewing the full context of the incident, but Marla didn't stop. She continued, "When a title has to save its own life with a card, this society has crossed into dangerous ground. So what about the people without a card, without a title? What do they use to protect themselves from an officer who can hide his face, his motive, and the truth?" Marla's question was cut short in the official TV broadcast, but the full version spread online within hours. Viewers didn't need further commentary. They had heard enough, seen too clearly the contrast between a man's position and how fragile a life becomes in the hands of law enforcement. In one clip from the press conference, a young journalist seated in the front row can be seen turning to scan the room after Marla finished speaking, as if waiting to see if anyone would nod, if anyone would dare to acknowledge it. But every face around him turned away. Eyes shifted, lips tightened, hands flipped through papers without reading. That silence alone made Marla's question echo long after the press conference ended. It didn't demand a direct answer. It forced every person present to face the truth that death doesn't come because someone lacks an ID. It comes because others believe they don't deserve to live if they can't prove they have the right to exist. Across the streets of Dorchester, new graffiti appeared on subway walls and old building facades. A simple image, a hand holding up a green card with a gold trim. Below it, the words, "So if it were you, what would you hold up?" In phrases that couldn't be said on camera, people had found a way to voice their fear through images. No artist name needed, no slogans shouted, just a question. And that question now follows every official, every officer, every politician, hoping to push the story backstage. But this time, there is no backstage, because the faces caught on camera, the voices recorded, and the words spoken by people like Marla DeWitt have already slipped past every attempt at containment. And with each passing day, the list of those who once believed they could hide now clearly knows no one can stay hidden forever. In a society learning how to remember, justice doesn't need to say names, but it knows every face that walked past it, and this time, it won't look away. While the Dorchester Police Department tried to patch its reputation with scattered statements and the absence of those involved, civil rights attorneys across the state moved in an entirely different direction. They didn't wait for Ellis Monroe to speak, didn't expect him to issue a formal response. In the judge's deliberate silence, they understood the message had already been delivered. Through action, through a look, through the way he held up that card on a muddy street without saying a word. On Wednesday morning, a coalition of 9 legal and human rights organizations filed a petition with the State Department of Justice demanding a full and independent investigation into the entire Dorchester Police Department. The petition cited not only Ellis's arrest, but also years of buried misconduct, repeatedly reported by residents and dismissed as unfounded. This time, they weren't asking for a review or for reassignment. They demanded full transparency of the department's operating culture, its internal processes, and its officer conduct oversight system. They called it a non-negotiable condition if the government wanted to reclaim any public trust. The 37-page petition was published publicly across multiple platforms, accompanied by a prominent image on the front page, a still taken from the original video, the moment Ellis Monroe looked up, blood still streaking his left cheek, holding up his Supreme Court ID card with a red circle drawn around the title. What was once evidence of a serious rights violation quickly broke free from legal confines to become a symbol of national reckoning. On Instagram, the image was printed on T-shirts with the caption, "Justice Bleeds Too." On Twitter, it became the backdrop for dozens of social campaigns under the name Raise the Card for Truth. In newspapers, the image was placed beside portraits of past Supreme Court justices, a silent but powerful contrast that in the history of the American judicial system, never had someone so high-ranking been forced to flash a card to prove their right to survive on the streets of their own country. Young people didn't need instruction to grasp the image's weight. In high schools, teachers projected it to open social discussions. Students wrote responses without templates. One 11th grade girl wrote, "If justice has to bleed to be seen, maybe it's time we ask who gets to be called human." In universities, law students included the image in final presentations, using it to explore the limits of police power and the force of imagery in exposing truth. Street artists painted the scene on brick walls, the red bleeding like real blood, forcing passers-by to stop. A local TV station dedicated a full segment to analyzing the image. The anchor called it a picture that needs no narration. Everything we need to know is already in his eyes. Inside closed-door city council meetings, the photo was printed and placed in front of every delegate. They couldn't talk about budgets, urban renovations, or zoning plans without seeing the blood of a man who once swore to uphold the Constitution staring at them from every sheet of paper. It stripped away excuses, shrunk political calculations into something nearly meaningless, because the question was no longer, how should we respond, but how much time do we have before the truth moves beyond our control? In Ellis Monroe's own office, the green and gold card still sat encased in glass, displayed on a shelf behind his desk. He never spoke of that moment again, never commented on how it spread. But anyone who entered that room would see it. It was no longer a badge of power. It was a reminder that one man could carry an entire system on his back, not through authority, but through a silence that forced a society to speak up. And from that day forward, people knew the image would outlast the final press conference. Because justice never belongs only to the powerful. It lives in the collective memory. And that memory now has a face, blood, and eyes. No one can erase it. 1 week after the image of Ellis Monroe became a nationwide symbol, the office of the Massachusetts Attorney General issued a special order. Attorney Veronica Mays was appointed as an independent investigator to review every arrest record over the past 4 years connected to Officer Logan Fry. Veronica was no stranger to the legal world. She had led the 2018 internal misconduct investigation in Baltimore, reopening silenced cases and forcing 5 senior officers to resign in just 7 months. She wasn't chosen for her reputation. She was chosen because she didn't compromise. When asked why she accepted the assignment, Veronica answered simply, because no one else should have to raise a card just to prove they're innocent. The quote was immediately picked up by the press and became the headline slogan across special reports on judicial reform. Within the first week, her team began extracting records and sorting through hundreds of arrests flagged for inconsistencies. Documents that had once sat quietly in file cabinets were now being examined under a different light. Her preliminary 18-page report stunned the state's Justice Office. Out of more than 200 arrests made directly by Logan Fry between 2019 and 2023, over 60% of those detained were people of color. Even more alarming, 40% of them were never properly informed of their rights when cuffed, including the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. This wasn't just a procedural error, it was grounds to invalidate the arrest records entirely, meaning a wave of cases could be dismissed due to initial violations committed by law enforcement. The data in Veronica's hands weren't just numbers. She ordered the re-interview of every individual listed in the flagged arrests. Some had since moved away, some didn't want to revisit it, and others still held citation slips they once thought they had no choice but to sign. A young man named Darius King, once arrested by Logan for suspicious behavior near a patrol car, said he had just been looking for his phone under the vehicle when he was shoved against a wall. No one asked what he was doing. No one told him he had the right to remain silent. Darius still had the report, with a messy signature next to consent to provide information without an attorney. Veronica didn't comment as she looked it over. She simply turned the page, marked it in red, and wrote 2 words: void record. Cases like Darius's were not rare. In a closed-door session with her legal advisory team, Veronica emphasized if 40% of arrestees weren't informed of their rights, this isn't individual negligence, it's a systemic habit. That statement rocked the state's legal establishment. Prosecutors began postponing upcoming trials tied to Logan Fry, awaiting the outcome of the investigation. Some judges quietly re-reviewed old case files, afraid they had issued rulings based on flawed reports. Community legal centers were flooded with calls for counsel. People began asking themselves, if a Supreme Court judge like Ellis Monroe had to flash a card, what value did Logan Fry's arrest reports hold beyond printed ink? Under mounting pressure, several members of the city council called for the investigation to be expanded to include the entire Night Patrol Division in Dorchester, where multiple arrests had previously lacked clear, justifiable evidence. Veronica Mays did not object. She simply submitted an additional proposal: temporarily invalidate all arrest reports signed by Logan Fry until the full investigation findings are released. That proposal wasn't easy to accept within a system used to shielding its own, but this time silence was no longer a safe option, because each reopened file was a moment the system had to face what it once hid. And this time, the old files weren't staying quiet. They were turning into indictments, louder than any statement. And in every line of those documents, justice began to speak, not with a badge, but with the truth, buried in dust. In a closed-door interrogation held at the Independent Investigation Office, Logan Fry entered the room, pale-faced, gray suit wrinkled, tie loosened, no trace left of the man who once smiled confidently while pinning others to the ground. He sat across from Veronica Mays, hands resting on the table, eyes meeting the woman who had turned his entire career record into a string of suspicions. The room had no public microphones, no media cameras, only those tasked with deciding whether he would become a fallen symbol or a scapegoat, used to prove the system's intent to reform. When asked about his past actions, Logan stayed silent for a few seconds before answering in a dry voice, "I only did what those before me did." The words fell like a confession without remorse, cowardly and honest at once, an admission of habit, a plea to shift blame onto a worn-out culture he once believed was armor against consequences. Veronica didn't respond immediately. She turned a page, looked closely at a line from an old victim statement, then closed the file and looked up, her voice so firm it seemed to tighten the air. "And that's why you think the law is tradition, not principle." No need to raise her voice, no need to slam the table. Just one sentence, but it threw Logan off course. He looked away, hands clasped, as if trying to take back what he'd just said. But Veronica didn't stop. She leaned forward, each word cutting like a blade against the illusion he was trying to wrap in precedent. If everyone just follows the ones before them, then what is this system for? To replicate mistakes or to end them? In the corner of the room, a note-taker glanced at the clock, not to check the time, but realizing that, for the first time in a series of interrogations, the accused had nothing left to argue against justice. Logan said nothing else. He sat silently, didn't nod, didn't sigh, a silence completely different from his defiant calm in front of the media. It wasn't calculation. It was the sudden shock to the foundation he had trusted in, that as long as he followed the superiors, signed the template, acted like the rest, no one could single him out. But Veronica wasn't asking about the collective. She forced Logan to answer for himself, and in that look, the phrase, "I was just following others," became evidence of the blindness of a generation raised in privilege. After the interrogation, Veronica stepped out of the room, handed the file to her assistant, and urgently requested a full report on Logan's entire training history at the police academy. She wasn't willing to wait, because in her view, if the one enforcing the law doesn't understand that the law is a principle, then the place that produced him must also be held accountable. And this time, the investigation couldn't stop at a single officer. It had to reach the very structure that created someone who believed violence was valid just because someone else had done it before. To Veronica, every excuse was a lead. And Logan's words, instead of lessening his guilt, only confirmed that the system had raised a generation that didn't ask what was right, only repeated what was familiar, without question. Logan's response leaked soon after, not through mainstream media, but from a transcription clerk who remembered the exchange and sent it to a blogger specializing in police misconduct. The quote was cited, analyzed, broken down, and shared as living proof of a truth long suspected, that many in law enforcement act not out of belief in justice, but out of habit, convenience, reward, or fear of disruption. But this time, the disruption had knocked, and it wasn't knocking softly. With everything now exposed, the public didn't just want a verdict for Logan, they wanted a full dissection of the training, oversight, and cover-up machinery that had produced him, because the truth is, the law is not tradition, it's a promise, signed in honor, and anyone who forgets that will be held to account by that promise, not with blood, but with truth, written in case files that cannot be torn away. As Veronica Mays's expanded investigation moved into verifying systemic misconduct across the entire Dorchester Police Department, a debate broke out at the highest levels of Massachusetts's judicial system. Should Ellis Monroe, Supreme Court Justice, be invited to directly oversee the investigation in which he was the central victim? The idea began with a group of lawmakers hoping to leverage his credibility and deep legal knowledge to ensure transparency throughout the process, while also signaling to the public that the system wasn't hiding from its failures, but was willing to let the harmed party help redefine justice. Some newspapers called it an unprecedented move in modern judicial history, while TV networks ran headlines, "When the victim is a judge, can he both rule and be in the record?" However, the debate quickly turned tense when opposing voices argued that Ellis's involvement, however qualified, would put him in a position open to claims of bias, turning a systemic inquiry into something too personal. Critics didn't attack him directly, but contended that his presence could lead every investigative outcome to be questioned for its motives, no matter how valid. Meanwhile, a contrasting wave of public opinion said that even questioning Ellis's legitimacy was itself proof of a deeper bias, that a black man, even a judge, was not allowed to simply be a victim. He must always remain rational, neutral, in control, and never allow himself to demand justice like any ordinary person. One journalist wrote, "We've turned him into the embodiment of law so much we forget he also has skin, blood, and wound." As the debate peaked, Ellis Monroe appeared at a long-scheduled academic seminar at Columbia Law School where he had planned to lecture on judicial independence. But he didn't speak about the Constitution, clauses, or even his own case. At the end of the talk, when asked directly whether he intended to participate in the investigation, Ellis gave a single, clear sentence: "I will not sit in a chair that could overshadow justice." The statement, delivered not for dramatic effect but as a firm stance, made clear that he would not allow his presence to become a pretext for others to dodge responsibility or to use his image to validate any predetermined conclusion. After that statement, he stepped down from the podium, gave no interviews, and left no further comment. But his words spread instantly, quoted as a rare standard of integrity in an era where everyone is trying to control the narrative. Some supporters expressed regret, saying it was a loss for the investigation, as his absence meant losing the insight of someone who understood the law, the people, and the hidden corner. But most, including independent analysts and legal scholars, saw something larger in his refusal, a man drawing the line between personal dignity and absolute loyalty to the principle of justice. Ellis understood that if he were present on the investigative panel, every conclusion, however accurate, could be doubted as subtle retaliation, and he would not allow anyone the chance to weaken the power of truth. In legal forums, his words were invoked as a kind of armor few could wear. Not everyone can step away from the spotlight while their honor is still being defended. But by stepping back, he forced others to take responsibility. He didn't reclaim fairness by holding power, he reclaimed it by standing outside, making the system prove it could correct itself. And so, Ellis Monroe didn't need to be in the investigation room. His name and his silence would cast a shadow over the entire process, a shadow that couldn't be erased, a refusal that carried no anger, but left behind a standard too great for those still learning to distinguish between vengeance and justice. Though he declined to take part in the investigation directly, Ellis Monroe's testimony was formally included in the case file. The deposition took place in a private room at the office of the judicial inspector, with no press, no audience, only a legal representative, an investigator, and a sealed audio recorder per regulation. Ellis arrived with his usual leather briefcase, no assistant, no documents, and no prepared statement. He simply sat down, listened to his rights, and agreed to answer all questions officially. For nearly an hour, his voice was steady and clear, recounting every detail of that night without embellishment or emotional color. He didn't raise his voice when describing being forced forced to the ground, didn't slow down when mentioning the blood on his face, and didn't use a single dramatic word to describe the officer's actions. The way he spoke made it easy to forget this was a man who might have died had he not pulled out the right card at the exact right second. Some called it the bearing of a judge, but the clerk transcribing that day said, "It was the way of someone who doesn't need to prove anything anymore. He told the truth, not to be pitied, and not to give anyone room to deny it." When the case file was completed, an excerpt from the final portion of Ellis Monroe's testimony was publicly released to clarify the cooperative tone and ethical direction he brought to the investigation. In the recording, his voice was low and steady, not a condemnation but a quiet verdict. "I don't need them to fall. I just need them to stand still and look at themselves." The sentence, brief as it was, quickly became an anchor in the ongoing discourse. Some said it was too soft, too forgiving toward those who had laid hands on another person's life through abused authority, but most recognized that it was precisely the restraint that made the words impossible to avoid. It didn't demand blood, didn't request penance, didn't set terms. It asked for the one thing the law enforcement system seemed never ready to do: face itself, not with reports, not with committees, but with an unflinching gaze at the consequences it had caused. The quote was soon cited in law ethics classes as an example of judicial character. Police academies began incorporating the audio clip into their lessons on civil rights and the limits of authority. No one was forced to listen, but those who once laughed when he fell now had to listen when he asked them to stop and look. In a commentary for The New Yorker, legal columnist Maria Lenz wrote, "He didn't ask why it happened, because he knew the system was designed to let it happen. But he made the system unable to forgive itself, because, for the first time, the victim asked it to examine itself." Inside the investigation office, the lead investigator, who had questioned hundreds of defendants over 2 decades, admitted he had never heard testimony like it. There were no tears, no repressed rage, no need for comfort. Ellis Monroe spoke like someone who had moved through pain but left behind marks that wouldn't fade. And from that final line, the entire nature of the investigation shifted. It was no longer about whether 3 officers had done wrong. It became a mirror reflecting how the entire law enforcement machine treated human rights, not just in the moment of arrest, but in the way they looked at, thought about, and treated those who didn't carry the privilege of being believed. That sentence was never spoken from a courtroom bench. There was no gavel, no ritual declaration, but to those now reopening file after file, it became the deepest indictment, because it came from someone who demanded no punishment, only confrontation. And that is the hardest thing for a system long accustomed to hiding behind the name of justice. Ellis Monroe stepped away from his seat, not to avoid power, but to protect its true meaning. And with every word he left in that transcript, each line echoed with a resonance the entire system could no longer ignore. Not because he reclaimed justice for himself, but because he handed justice a mirror, unwarped and unflinching, to finally see what it had become. In the 3rd week of the independent investigation, the State Inspector General's office, in coordination with the Interagency Audit Team, released a special 94-page report focusing on all administrative violations previously handled internally at the Dorchester Police Department over the past 5 years. The report wasn't made public immediately, but was first sent to members of the City Council, the Government Communications Office, and 3 independent human rights organizations for final data verification before release. Even the 7-page executive summary sent out was enough to shake public opinion, which clearly stated 22 cases where officers were found to have violated arrest protocols, including bypassing Miranda warnings, detaining individuals beyond legal time limits, using disproportionate force, and failing to file complete reports. Notably, Logan Fry's name appeared in 7 of those cases, nearly a third of the list, all of which had been resolved internally with minor minor disciplinary action, including ethics counseling sessions or written reprimands that never led to suspension. The fact that Logan had previously been redecorated yet continued to violate procedures and was still promoted within the system left no room for doubt about the presence of institutional shielding. One section of the report stated plainly, none of the violations involving Logan Fry were referred to independent oversight. All disciplinary actions were approved by senior command at the Dorchester precinct. The name of former police chief Raymond Coyle appeared repeatedly as the signatory for those decisions. From there, what began as a probe into 3 individuals expanded into a deeper excavation of systemic operations. In an emergency meeting between investigators and state officials, a resolution was made. Raymond Coyle would be officially summoned for questioning as the individual responsible for authorizing internal handling of major misconduct cases. Fueling the fire was testimony from a former administrative staff member who disclosed that during his tenure, Coyle had verbally directed night patrol units to conduct a cleanup campaign around the southern metro zone with the unofficial goal of completely removing the homeless population from the subway area during peak hours. Handwritten notes attached to leaked internal emails repeated a single directive: keep the streets clean for the media lens. Officers were instructed to place individuals without ID, wearing ragged clothing or deemed visually disruptive to public image on a special surveillance list. That list included at least 3 individuals previously arrested by Logan Fry for loitering without purpose. With no concrete evidence of any criminal offense, Raymond Coyle initially denied all involvement, claiming the Metro sweep operations were spontaneous patrol initiatives driven by public safety concerns. But evidence from emails, testimonies from former staff, and internal records rendered his denial flimsy. Coyle was suspended from access to departmental documents for the first time in his 28-year career and was required to appear before a state-appointed hearing committee. In a questioning session that lasted over 3 hours, he answered more than 60 questions but deflected most direct responsibility. What he couldn't deflect, however, was the mounting stack of data, from internal management protocols to the way every violation had been systematically muted through organized silence. The press labeled the event a backstage unmasking of an entire era governed by verbal commands. A legal analyst commented, Logan's misconduct was the drop, but without the rusty basin named Raymond Coyle, no one could have held that much waste. The investigation had shifted from assigning individual blame to unearthing the network of those who worked to keep everything off record, burying what should have been documented beneath closed-door meetings. And that system, now collapsing column by column, foundation by foundation, wasn't undone by a viral video. It was already rotting from the inside. Truth is now peeling back every layer of paint, and no one stands untouched when all the walls crack in the same direction. What began with an audit report and a series of hearings with former officers quickly led journalists to uncover a truth no longer concealable. The program, marketed as slum clearance, once praised as an urban renewal and public safety initiative, was in reality a coordinated cover for population control, targeting communities of color near city centers. Leaked internal documents revealed that the objective, to reduce indistinct loitering, was informally understood as a directive to purge individuals with visibly impoverished appearances, primarily Black residents, Latin Americans, and some immigrant groups. Areas labeled slums were largely home to long-established African American families, many of whom were informal laborers or unemployed. No actual relocation support plans were introduced. The nightly sweep campaigns, under the guise of public order, were nothing more than attempts to remove what urban planners deemed unsightly to tourists and the media. As public outrage intensified, further reports from Veronica May's investigative team revealed yet another layer of systemic structure. Many policies had been written in vague administrative language, but were widely understood by local precinct captains as coded signals to target specific demographic groups. Logan Fry was merely one visible link in that chain, Behind him were layers of verbal orders, handwritten notes with no official record, and internal meetings that were never formally documented. It was a machinery running in silence, protected by layers of power intertwined among local police, municipal authorities, and a number of real estate investors behind redevelopment plans. The press dubbed the unfolding exposé Dorchester's Dark Map. At a closed judicial conference in Boston, gathering federal judges, legal scholars, and senior policymakers, Ellis Monroe was invited to speak during a special session on the role and limits of coercive power. He stepped up to the podium without notes, speaking slowly but clearly. Police are not the military. Citizens are not targets. The statement wasn't meant to provoke emotion, but to draw a line, forcing everyone in the room to reconsider. If power is used to dominate appearances, can justice still hold its true form? Ellis didn't condemn individuals. He simply redrew the boundary between two concepts the system had started to blur. Maintaining order does not mean extinguishing life. And if society accepts a model of coercion based on appearance, geography, and bias, then who among them will be the next target tomorrow? That question rang out in a hall so silent one could hear pens dragging across pages. And in that moment, justice was no longer a topic of discussion, it became a demand. After nearly 6 weeks of investigation, questioning, and the review of hundreds of old case files, Veronica Mays stepped up to the podium at the main building of the Massachusetts Office of the Inspector General. In her hand was a 200-page investigative report marked urgent and simultaneously sent to the prosecutor's office, the state Supreme Court, and the Police Ethics Commission. She didn't read the entire document, but highlighted 2 key points. Officer Logan Fry was officially indicted on 3 charges, including violation of civil rights, falsifying statements in law enforcement reports, and abuse of power in arrests without clear legal grounds. Darren Whitlow, the officer who recorded and disseminated a mocking video of the victim, would face a disciplinary hearing with the potential of permanent discertification. In response to reporters afterward, Veronica said only one sentence: "The law is not a mirror for people to admire their own image. It is a mirror that reflects what we try to hide." Then she walked away without looking back. In the final session, when Logan Fry was brought in for supplemental testimony before the prosecutor's office finalized the indictment, he did not resist or present any elaborate defense, as many had predicted. He simply bowed his head, sighed, then looked directly at the stenographer and said in a voice tinged with despair, "I saw a ragged man. I was never taught to respect someone like that." That statement did not constitute a legal admission of guilt, but it laid bare a deeper truth than any charge could. The system he grew up in, trained in, wore the uniform from, had never taught him to distinguish between appearance and dignity. It was a place where law enforcement authority was not paired with ethical instruction, where the impulse to control others' image had become an occupational norm. Logan's words were quickly cited in social commentaries as a stark dividing line between the training institutions for police and the actual outcomes on the streets. People no longer asked why Logan struck someone or mocked the victim, but instead asked who made him believe it was allowed. In an editorial for The Atlantic, a writer specializing in domestic security policy posed the question: if an officer declares he was never taught to respect the poor, then who is writing their training curriculum, and who approved the final draft? These questions forced state authorities to launch a full audit of police academy course content and to reassess recruitment processes in regions with a high risk of racial conflict. What began as an investigation into misconduct was now expanding into a full reckoning of the foundation on which authority was trained. Something once considered untouchable. At a legal forum held the same day at Georgetown University, a female law professor and former federal prosecutor stated, "When someone in uniform openly says he was never taught to respect the poor, that's no longer a personal story. That's a declaration from a training system that forgot about humanity." Her remarks were quoted in nearly every evening newscast. No one pushed back, because everyone understood that justice cannot exist if those who enforce it don't know who deserves to be treated with dignity. And justice cannot be strong if it relies on the identity of the victim to determine what's right or wrong. Ellis Monroe did not appear at any of the hearings. He kept his original promise. He would not place himself in a position that might overshadow the very process he was asking others to uphold. But in private meetings among scholars and legal experts, people still spoke of his eyes, the way he held up the card in silence, the way he refused to retaliate. Because of his presence, even from outside the spotlight, he had become a mirror held up everyone else. And that mirror wasn't meant to flatter. It was the kind that forced those who once believed justice was a privilege to look back at themselves. And in that reflection, the system truly began to collapse, not from outside pressure, but from the shame growing within. At the public disciplinary hearing held by the Police Oversight Council, beneath the glare of TV cameras and among crowds packed into the hallways of the state government building, few noticed the black man sitting quietly in the third row, near the corner, his back against the worn wooden bench. He wasn't wearing judicial robes, no badge of office, and his face gave away no expression. It was Ellis Monroe. For 2 straight hours of justifications, explanations, and legal defenses presented by representatives of Logan Fry and Darren Whitlow, Ellis did not move, did not lower his head, did not react to a single word. He simply sat there, eyes fixed forward, at the place where a system that once tried to crush him was now struggling to redefine itself. His silence was not withdrawal nor resistance, but a steady anchor that kept the whole room from looking away. Anyone who glanced over at him knew that presence wasn't there to demand anything. It was there to remind everyone that the cost of silence had once been blood, and now it was a mirror. After the hearing, while reporters swarmed the attorneys and counsel spokespeople, Ellis quietly exited through a side door, without a secretary, without an escort car. But a few people still recognized him, and in an instant, microphones were raised, questions fired off. Are you satisfied with today's decision? Do you think the sentence is enough? Will you forgive them? Ellis paused for just a beat, eyes looking off into the distance as if weighing something not meant for the press, then turned to a young female reporter closest to him and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "They've seen me. Now I want them to see themselves." Not a word more. No elaboration. He walked away, leaving the crowd standing still, as if they had just heard a verdict delivered without the sound of a gavel. That sentence later appeared on the front page of major newspapers, bolded like a reminder society couldn't avoid. It was quoted in panel discussions, used as a slogan by legal reform groups, and printed on banners during marches demanding judicial transparency. In a live-streamed academic roundtable among law professors, one scholar commented, "That's a statement free of moral pretense. It doesn't preach, doesn't judge. It simply asks for one seemingly simple thing: look inward." And that seemingly simple thing, in the context of a system built on avoiding responsibility, had become the hardest ask, because when the victim refuses to center himself, he inadvertently forces everyone else into the direct line of truth. There's no one left to blame, no one to deflect toward, no excuse to cling to. Ellis stepped back at the exact moment that turned his presence into a mirror held up to the conscience of the system, a mirror unstained by power or pity. And because he said nothing more, society was left to complete the rest of the story on its own. In a first-year law class, a professor assigned students to write reflections on the hearing. One young student wrote, "If he had cried, I might have looked away, but because he was silent, I had to listen." That response made its way to the school office and quietly circulated as an example of the power of wordless presence. Ellis Monroe never needed a podium to leave an impression. He only needed a seat close enough to remind them that they were the answer. And from the third row that day, he delivered a message deeper than any verdict that could be written in legal language. Because in the history of justice, there are moments when truth doesn't need a voice, only someone who refuses to look away. Ellis chose to be that person, and his final words didn't close a case. They opened a door that society can no longer shut. The official verdict was delivered on Monday morning in a courtroom outfitted with extra seating to accommodate a surge in public interest. Logan Fry was convicted of abuse of power, falsifying legal records, and violating civil rights. The sentence was not the maximum possible, but it was enough to strip him of all professional privileges and place his name on a nationwide permanent disqualification list. Darren Whitlow was not criminally charged, but was immediately dismissed for violating professional ethics and humiliating a victim through an unauthorized video. Following the verdict, media outlets simultaneously released archived clips from prior internal complaints, made public for the first time without edits, muted audio, or blurred faces. These images didn't just expose one isolated act, but a pattern of systemic behavior, repeated, normalized, and unquestioned. At Boston University's School of Law, a group of final-year students designed a special sticker, a small square, dark blue background, thin gold border, with the words Supreme Court printed boldly in white, mimicking the ID Ellis Monroe raised the night he was pinned, bleeding, to the ground. Beneath the words they added a handwritten quote, "Stick it to your heart before stepping outside." The sticker wasn't for sale, only distributed for free. People began placing them on backpacks, laptops, bulletin boards, bathroom mirrors, and even printed on handkerchiefs and cards tucked into law books. No one needed to be reminded who Ellis Monroe was. The card became a symbol, not for the title it bore, but because it had once drawn the line between life and death in a society where prejudice could kill over blood and a torn coat. The student's gesture wasn't a call for rebellion, but a reminder that justice doesn't live in one person's pocket. It has to be carried inside everyone who walks into the world with dignity and the right to exist whole. International media began using the case as a key example in reports on reforming America's law enforcement system. Names once confined to staffing rosters now appeared in teaching materials, conferences, and textbooks. But beyond the verdict, beyond institutional reform, what remained was something no document could capture: the feeling of being forced to reflect, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The truth had moved beyond one face, one ID card, one arrest. It now lived in the way the story was told, not as a legal case, but as a new moral threshold society could no longer turn away from. And that, Ellis never said out loud, but now everyone understood. After the trial and the wave of investigations that followed, many police departments across the country began reviewing their entire training curricula for frontline officers. In an internal report from the New Haven Police Department, the first new item added was a course on implicit bias, a program previously treated as a token appendix in the training track, now upgraded to mandatory with twice the duration. Active officers were also required to attend reassessment sessions, where they had to confront the very mental patterns they might be carrying into their duties. A range of sociologists, human rights activists, and judges were invited to teach and pose direct questions. When you see someone in tattered clothes, what's the first thing that comes to your mind in the first 5 seconds? There was no room for safe answers. These classrooms no longer taught how to use handcuffs, but how to recognize what was inside their own minds that needed to be unshackled first. In the media, people began using the phrase "the Monroe effect" to describe the wave of institutional response spreading outward from the Dorchester case. But Ellis Monroe himself didn't appear at any reform summits or public panels. He kept his routine of walking to the Supreme Court in the early morning, still sat in his office overlooking the park, and still read case files with a red pen instead of a screen. Journalists repeatedly requested interviews. Universities sent invitations, but all declined. He had stated clearly in a closed-door meeting, "I don't represent a movement, I'm just someone who chose not to look away." Yet his silence didn't stop the stream of handwritten letters, thank you cards, and sometimes folded scraps in anonymous envelopes sent to the Supreme Court. They came in all voices: people who had been discriminated against, forgotten, nearly erased by the law, and others who had never experienced any of it, but who, for the first time, felt justice wasn't out of reach. One letter was personally chosen by Ellis's clerk to be kept, not because it was long or elaborate, but because it was so simple it hardly needed editing. A piece of notebook paper, written in black ink, smudged in a few places, signed Mason. age 14. The boy wrote, "I used to think if I grew up and got arrested for being black, nobody would care. But then I saw you got arrested, and you didn't fight back. You didn't scream. You just stood up. If I ever get arrested one day, I hope someone stands up like you did." Ellis read the letter during his lunch break, sitting beside a cold cup of coffee and a stack of case files still awaiting signature. He said nothing to the clerk, just placed the letter into the wooden box he used for documents not yet needing action, and slid it gently into the corner of his desk. But the clerk later said that was the only time she ever saw him sit still for a long while, without turning to the next page. The letter never appeared in the media, never became a symbol. But for Ellis, it was enough to prove something that no survey ever needed to confirm. Real change doesn't begin in auditoriums, but in the children watching every move the adult world makes. And when a child believes that justice can stand tall without drawing a weapon or raising their voice, that belief is no longer personal. Surrendering the police was no longer a personal. It is proof that society can still heal if enough people choose to step forward and stand still at the right moment. Ellis didn't reply to the letter, but that day he left a brief note for his clerk. "If there are more letters from Mason, put them straight into this box." Not because he expected more thanks, but because he understood that sometimes one child willing to see the truth is enough to force an entire system to change how it reflects its own image, and that is something no court can declare. Only life has the authority to recognize it. That morning, the Massachusetts Supreme Court was unusually silent. The main chamber, typically used for academic panels and judicial conferences, had been entirely rearranged to host a closed-door symposium titled "Redefining the Boundaries of Public Power: From the Dorchester Case to Nationwide Judicial Reform." On the nameplates in front of each chair were the names of federal judges, legislative experts, leading legal scholars, and a few carefully selected guests. But among all the labeled seats, there was one honorary chair, placed dead center, directly across from the speaker's podium, completely empty. No name, no water, no accompanying documents. Just a wooden chair with gray upholstery, standing out in the silence of the room. The organizers gave no explanation, made no announcement, but everyone understood. That chair wasn't reserved for someone to speak. It was for someone who had once been pinned face down to the ground, simply because he didn't dress the way those with guns and badges expected. Ellis Monroe entered nearly 10 minutes after the symposium had begun. The rear door opened without a sound, and no one noticed him until he stepped fully into the back row of the audience. No robe, no badge of office, no assistant in tow. He wore a simple suit and carried a small folder of papers. Ellis didn't move toward the front, didn't scan the room. He quietly chose a seat in the far back corner and sat down. A few turned to look, and someone considered offering him a better seat, but he shook his head. Not necessary. He hadn't come to be a centerpiece. He had come to listen. The moderator glanced toward the back row, paused briefly, then continued as if nothing had changed. One by one, the speakers took the podium. A scholar presented on implicit bias in legal education. A federal judge emphasized the need for independent oversight mechanisms, and a final-year law student shared what it felt like to witness a hearing where justice didn't flinch from reality. Yet throughout every presentation, everyone was acutely aware of his presence as an undeniable truth. No one called his name, no one asked him to speak, but no one dared speak, as if he weren't there. At one point, someone approached the empty chair in the center and asked the organizer, "Should we seat someone here?" The organizer replied softly, barely above a whisper, "That chair is to remind us who once wasn't allowed to sit." That answer wasn't shared publicly, but it spread quickly, through glances, through the hush in the room, through the subtle shift in tone as people began to deliver their remarks, because they realized in that room, not everyone was there to speak. Someone had come to make us hear ourselves. When the symposium ended, Ellis was the first to leave. He stood up just as the final applause faded, didn't turn back, didn't say goodbye, simply nodded at the person near the door, then walked straight into the hallway. No one followed, no reporters rushed in. Everyone understood that if he had wanted to speak, he'd had hundreds of chances. But sometimes presence in silence is what forces an entire system to listen most deeply. And that chair in the center of the room, no name, no owner, no speech, remained behind as a living testament that there was a time when someone like him wasn't invited to the table, even while holding the highest judicial title in the state. The next day, a photo spread across social media, a wide shot of the symposium with the focus on the empty chair in the middle. No caption, no slogan, but the top comment came from an anonymous account. This chair is empty because someone was once seen as unworthy of sitting. Now the whole room is sitting because he once stood. That line wasn't praise, it was a reminder, and in legal history, some sessions don't end with resolutions, but with recognition. Recognition that some seats never needed a name, because they already carried enough weight to redefine the entire system. As the final speaker stepped down, the head of the State Justice Committee stood from the front row, took the microphone, and spoke in a voice that was clear but not raised. He looked toward the back of the room, where Ellis Monroe still sat quietly, and said, "Justice Monroe, if you're willing, we would be honored to hear a few words from the one whose silence made society listen." The whole room turned. Ellis remained in his seat, back straight, gaze steady. He rose slowly, but didn't walk to the stage. He took a single step out of the row, then turned to face the room. His voice was even, low, and loud enough for the last row to hear. "I didn't come here to be honored. I came to make sure no one is ever humiliated without someone bearing witness." He didn't wait for applause. As the last word left his lips, he returned to his seat. The moderator didn't interrupt, didn't prompt. The air felt compressed. No deep breaths, no shifting chairs, only a silent space suspended between that empty seat on stage and the words he had just left behind. The emotional current in the room wasn't led by loud praise, but by a quiet consensus, the kind that only forms when no argument remains. A law student sitting in the second row, notebook in hand throughout the session, later wrote in a final essay, "That empty chair, for the first time, I saw a seat carry more weight than the person who might have sat in it. Because it didn't represent glory, it marked a space the system had left vacant for far too long. And he didn't fill it. He left it where it was, as a reminder. Some places are not meant to be occupied, but to be seen." That sentence was later quoted by a professor in a lecture on legal ethics. It didn't just describe a moment, it captured the entire spirit of that symposium, where one individual's step back magnified a collective responsibility. Ellis Monroe didn't need to stand in the spotlight to make others reflect. His presence alone was enough to serve as a mirror, not for regret, but for change. Because when someone refuses to be honored, they're not rejecting value, they're returning it to the community, placing the weight of justice back in everyone's hands. And in that moment, the empty chair at the center of the room became a living object. It didn't need someone to sit in it to complete a ritual. It existed as a rupture between two eras, one where the oppressed had no place to be seen, and another where every eye knows it must pause before a wound still healing. As the hall slowly emptied, many people remained. Some took photos of the empty chair, others stood silently in front of it for a few minutes. Ellis was the last to leave, not to avoid attention this time, but because he chose to stay until the chair was no longer viewed as a symbol, but as a quiet reminder. On his way to the exit, he passed a student carefully cleaning the glass doors. The student stood up, nodded respectfully, and said nothing. Ellis nodded back. No words were needed. True respect doesn't come from hearing much, but from knowing when and where to stop. And that day, the entire building learned it, not through a lecture, but through a space left untouched, like justice itself, not belonging to anyone, but to all who are brave enough not to look away when it takes the form of silence. When the echoes of the hearings faded and the media moved on to new headlines, the only thing that continued to spread wasn't Ellis Monroe stepping out of a conference room, or the brief words he once left behind. On social media, people gradually stopped sharing his face, close-up photos, video clips from the night he was arrested, even footage of him walking away from the back row during the symposium, all began to disappear from the timeline. In their place, a single image kept appearing, imprinting itself into memory. The green card marked Supreme Court, blood-stained, circled in red ink with a jagged stroke, the frame trembling slightly as if the photographer's hand hadn't steadied after the shock. That image became the symbol spreading across platforms, printed on posters, framed in law school corridors, and even seen in coffee shops located in neighborhoods once tightly policed. A blogger with millions of followers wrote a post just 3 sentences long, quickly quoted everywhere. "We don't need to see his face to feel ashamed of our silence. All we need to see is that card. Because it isn't a symbol of power, it's proof that justice was once beaten in the street, and no one spoke up." The statement didn't aim to stir emotions, but it struck directly at reason, an admission hard to deny, because the greatest fear isn't being insulted, but having witnessed something wrong and choosing to stay silent. Ellis never called anyone to act. He never demanded empathy, but simply by existing beyond any justification, he made that card, plain, old, bloodied, carry more weight than any well-known face. That card didn't speak, but it made others think, and for that, it was terrifying. Not because of the authority printed on it, but because of the memory it carried. The memory of a society that once trampled justice while believing it was enforcing the law. Now, people keep that image not to honor a single person, but to remind themselves that no one can ever again claim, "I didn't know," because some symbols, once revealed, revoke the right to look away, and Ellis, by stepping back, gave society exactly the mirror it needed, without needing to stand in front of it to be acknowledged. Logan Fry was permanently banned from practicing law enforcement. The ruling was delivered in a brief court session, without media frenzy, without crowds at the courthouse gates, and without hashtags flooding the feed. The room held only those required to be there: a few judicial officials, court clerks, and Logan, sitting alone beside his appointed attorney, head bowed, hands folded across his lap, as if gripping himself to stay together. When the presiding judge read the final line of the verdict, confirming the permanent revocation of the right to wear the uniform and exercise authority, Logan didn't react. But he also never once looked back. The rows of seats where victims were once invited to witness the process of justice were nearly empty that day. Ellis Monroe was absent, just as he had been absent from most places where people expected him to appear. No protest, no symbolic presence, just an absence timed so precisely that it let the silence speak for everything that needed to be said. As the court clerk finalized the recording of the sentencing, a short archival video was played at the end, a clip showing Ellis Monroe's oath of office on the day he was appointed Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. His face on screen was sharp, composed, eyes locked straight into the lens. But what lingered was the voice, steady and slow. "I'd rather stay silent at the right moment than speak in the wrong place, because sometimes justice doesn't need words. It just needs someone to stand in the right position." The statement wasn't meant as a rebuttal or a prophecy, but now, replayed in a courtroom where the man who once arrested him could no longer lift his head, it became the most fitting conclusion, not to a single case, but to an era that needed to close. Logan listened to the entire video. Someone noticed his shoulder twitch slightly, but no one could say for sure whether it was regret or just the reflex of someone who had just lost what once let him stand taller than others. But everyone knew that moment didn't belong to Logan. It belonged to what he once mocked, once shattered, once treated as invisible in the world of law enforcement. The stillness of a man who never needed to speak to make a society reflect. Ellis wasn't there, but his shadow stretched across the courtroom floor like a mark no one could erase. Because when someone has been disregarded even at the highest level of justice, their absence becomes the most powerful way to force a system to face itself. Not through rage, not through demands for retribution, but through a quiet withdrawal that leaves everyone else to carry their share of the truth that's come to light. And that day, the verdict didn't just strip power from one man. It ended the illusion that a name could outweigh morality. In that silence, society heard, for the first time, the most unsettling truth. Justice was no longer something to declare. It was something that could no longer be avoided. After the investigation closed, and the system began to shift piece by piece, Veronica Mays, who once led the independent inquiry team, made a bold proposal to establish a legal support fund specifically for victims of wrongful arrest, especially those who couldn't afford legal counsel or had been sidelined from the judicial process due to administrative reasons. The fund wasn't named after any prominent individual, wasn't tied to any brand or political symbol, and carried only a simple name: Justice Without Badge. At the top of the list of initial sponsors was the name Ellis Monroe. He didn't attend the fund's press launch, didn't record any statements, and didn't let his portrait appear on the project's website. But his contribution was among the largest, accompanied by a brief note sent privately to Veronica: use this money to get someone nameless out of a holding corridor before the system erases their name for good. It wasn't a thank you, nor an attempt at redemption. It was the quiet continuation of someone who had once been seen as no one and who had survived only because he happened to carry the right ID at the right moment. Shortly after the fund's announcement, a memorial was held at Dorchester Central Park, without fanfare or media coverage in advance, yet attendance exceeded all expectations. There were no angry placards, no political slogans, just clusters of people standing around wooden boards placed across the grass, each bearing a name, sometimes just a nickname given by neighbors, sometimes simply the line, unidentified, followed by the year of arrest and a brief description of injuries from medical records: bruising on left wrist, scrape on right cheekbone, fresh scar on shoulder. No one read the names aloud. People just stopped for a few seconds, hands brushing the edge of each board like an unspoken apology society never got around to offering. There were no speeches, no stage, just a scattering of plain wooden benches under the trees, left for families who had once walked out of police stations with no paperwork, acknowledging their children had even been held. As evening settled in, a group of high school students from a nearby campus tied white ribbons around each name board. One of them handwrote a message and taped it beneath: "We remember you, even if the system forgot." It wasn't something taught in school nor lifted from any textbook, but it carried exactly the spirit the memorial sought to preserve. Justice is not just for the names that make headlines, but for those erased from every record. Ellis Monroe was not at the park that evening, but someone noticed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums placed between two name boards, without surnames, without photos, just a handwritten line, once called nameless, but witness to a truth no one can erase. There was no signature, but the way the bouquet was placed, neatly, the wrapping paper smooth and the handwriting so precise, was enough for those who knew him to understand where it came from. And that silence once again made people stand longer before the names that seemed forgotten. Because when justice starts to see even those without seats, without badges, and without voices left to speak, it stops being a hope. It becomes action. In a private audio recording circulated within the legal community but never released publicly, Ellis Monroe spoke during a closed meeting with his advisors. His voice was calm, without self-importance or condescension, simply recounting something that needed to be properly understood. A title doesn't protect anyone. It just makes it easier for people to hear you. The line stirred no debate, needed no elaboration, but spread quickly. Printed and posted on the bulletin boards of law offices, used as the opening quote in an industry journal, and even turned into a debate prompt for final-year law students. Because it wasn't a lesson from a lecture hall, but from the lived reality of someone who had held the highest judicial title and still been forced to lie face down on a sidewalk under the flash of police headlights just because of a bloodstain and a torn shirt. Ellis didn't say it to diminish the law's role. He said it to remind that a person's worth isn't measured by what's clipped to their chest, but by how society chooses to see them, even before they've had a chance to speak. 1 month after the memorial for the unnamed victims, at a small community library on the outskirts of Dorchester, a children's reading event was held. In the crowd of kids scrambling for books, a boy wearing a brown knit cap and holding a notebook folded into a makeshift book cover happened to stand next to an older man shelving books in the criminal law section. When he noticed the man's eyes resting on the title, Justice for Ordinary People, the boy turned and asked cautiously, "You read that one too, sir?" The man nodded. The boy smiled. "I wrote a letter to a judge once. His name was Ellis Monroe. I don't know if he ever read it." The man replied simply, "I've heard about that letter." The boy nodded again, then went on talking about a law class soon starting at school, about how his friends now wanted to learn so one day they could understand the law before someone uses it against us. Before leaving, he said, "I hope I get to meet him someday." Ellis watched him go, saying nothing at first. When the boy turned back because he forgot his backpack, the man said softly, "You don't have to recognize him. You just need to believe you deserve respect." The boy looked at him for a few seconds, then nodded and ran off. There was no dramatic recognition, no tearful cinematic moment, but in that look, a new generation was quietly growing up, one that didn't need permission to exist, only the understanding that they had the right to. And Ellis Monroe, the man who once walked out of the halls of power with blood on his cheek and his head held high, continued to choose the quietest place to ignite the biggest thing, dignity that doesn't come from a title, but from how society chooses to see children like Mason, enough for them not to need to know anyone's name to believe that justice can be real. 1 month after the statewide internal reform program was launched, a group of young police officers from the Dorchester Training Academy voluntarily sent a letter to Chief Justice Ellis Monroe's office. In the letter, they didn't ask for advice or submit a petition. They simply wrote that they wanted to meet him as individuals about to wear the bad G, but who had never known what it felt like to bow their heads before the failures of the system they were about to serve. The final line of the letter read, "We want to start over, not with another training module, but by listening to someone who was once brought down by the very thing we're learning to enforce." Ellis didn't reply immediately, but a few days later, the clerk's office announced he would meet with them one afternoon. No press, no cameras, no speaking list. The meeting was held in a secondary conference room at the Massachusetts Supreme Court, a space typically reserved for special citizen appointments. Soft lighting, a small round table, no podium. Ellis Monroe entered right on time, walking slowly, holding a stack of case files he never opened. He looked at each person in the group, most just in their early 20s, some still wearing academy pins, some stepping into this building for the first time. They greeted him, sat up straight, ready to receive a lesson from a figure they saw as a symbol. But he didn't lecture. He only said one sentence, the only thing he said the entire meeting. "When you see a ragged person, what's the first thing you think?" The question hung in the room, not accusatory, not demanding an answer. Ellis didn't ask for a reply, just sat there, his gaze steady without judgment. One person swallowed hard, another looked down at their shoes. No one spoke right away, because they understood this wasn't a question to be answered out loud. It was meant to dig into what they'd been hiding: bias, assumptions, fear of being wrong, and the numbness that had been trained into them under the guise of logic. And with that one question, Ellis wasn't just making them face the victims, but making them face themselves. The meeting ended in under 20 minutes. There were no goodbyes, no final advice, but each person walked out with a changed expression, lighter or heavier, depending on what they had just realized. Ellis stayed behind a little longer, sitting in the now empty room, his eyes resting on the seat just vacated by a young officer, then nodding slightly as if confirming something unspoken. Because he knew there are things that can't be taught and can't be ordered. They can only be unearthed with the right question, and a silence long enough that no one can hide it anymore. And from there, real change can begin. A moment of silence stretched in the room after Ellis's question. With afternoon light light slanting through the glass, making every detail in their expressions more visible than the certainty they had brought with them. Shoulders once squared began to sag, their eyes not on him, but on the space in front of them, as if searching through the things they used to take for granted. Finally, one of them spoke. His voice was small, uncertain, but honest, like a confession to himself. It's circumstance, not a threat. That sentence didn't get applause, and it didn't become a declaration, but it settled like water, seeping deep, cutting through the reflexes that had been drilled into them. Ellis said nothing. He simply nodded once, lightly, as if in agreement, but also as acknowledgement. That nod wasn't confirmation that the speaker had answered correctly, but a kind of permission to go further into their own awareness. The kind of awareness that rarely finds space within rules and discipline. No one lifted a pen to take notes. No one in the room stood up to summarize or ask for a signature as a keepsake. The meeting ended with no closing ritual. Ellis stood, straightened the still-sealed folder, and walked out the door into a silence of complete respect. No advice, no instructions. Just one question left behind. Open, resonant, and unanswered. But that was the starting point he intended, because if each officer carried that question home, to confront it during every encounter with the public, it would carry more weight than any training module or slogan painted on a station wall. That day, Ellis didn't return straight to his office. He walked a longer route through the old neighborhood, the one where the memorial had once stood for those without official titles. He didn't stop, didn't drop by any familiar shop, but his gaze swept over every window, every park bench, as if checking an invisible map, because he understood that real answers are never found at podiums or inside courtrooms, but in everyday life, where people might forget the law, but still remember how to look at another human being without prejudice. And only when the one wearing the badge starts relearning that will the badge truly deserve to remain. As for him, he left behind the question and walked on, like someone clearing a path without needing a nameplate, just needing someone to truly keep going. Just needing someone to truly keep going. Many years had passed since the night Ellis Monroe was pinned to the ground, bleeding in a Dorchester alley, and society had managed to change more than most had dared to hope. In the training curriculum for recruits at the State Police Academy, the first section of the course, Ethics and Professional Bias, didn't begin with rules or case law, but with a special file preserved almost exactly as it was, the Monroe Case File, a 40-page document, accompanied by the leaked video from that year, internal reports, and notes from investigative attorneys. New cadets were asked not only to read the content carefully, but to study the silences in the testimonies, the pauses where no one pressed charges, and the eyes in photographs that came without captions. In one morning class, amid the sound of pages flipping and pens underlining key phrases, a young cadet raised his hand. He didn't ask about arrest procedures, nor did he debate the legality of the mistaken ID twist. He asked only one question: why did he stay silent for so long? The question made the entire classroom fall still. The instructor, a seasoned officer who had served during the post-reform era, set his pen down and thought for a moment. Then he spoke slowly, as if rereading what he had lived through. Because sometimes words aren't heavy enough to make people stop, but silence, at the right moment, can force an entire system to face itself. The cadet nodded, no follow-up. But in his eyes, something had shifted, something no curriculum could teach and no exam could measure. Because from the Monroe story, they didn't just learn the limits of power, but came to understand the limits of personal pride within a system that once believed titles could excuse any failure. When the class ended, the instructor lingered, eyes on the header Monroe Case 2025, then closed the file by hand. He knew the day would come when no one would need to flash a badge to survive, not because society was flawless, but because it had learned to see people before seeing paperwork. And Ellis Monroe, by refusing to speak, had forced an entire generation to redefine justice, not with a courtroom speech, but with blood on his cheek, a nod at the right time, and a question that needed no answer. That was when the story shifted from an isolated lesson to a moral foundation. And when the system begins there, the green badge becomes a historical symbol. Because no one should need to hold up a badge to be respected, they only need to be seen the right way. From the very first time, the training supervisor placed a hand on the old file when the cadet hesitantly asked again, as if needing to confirm that what he was about to say wasn't a conclusion, but something life had already proven. He spoke, voice low but clipped enough for the whole class to absorb, because he knew if you have to scream to be respected, then the system was wrong from the start. That answer wasn't meant to close the question, but to place it exactly where it belonged. Because justice, in its purest form, doesn't need to shout or fight for space. It just needs someone to hold their belief in it long enough, still enough, to make society confront why it ever looked away. A few weeks later, during a closed meeting on constitutional reform at the state Supreme Court, Ellis Monroe appeared unannounced. He sat quietly by the window at the back of the room, where there was no nameplate, no official role. Soft light filtered through the glass, catching the silver in his now nearly white hair, but his spine remained straight, his posture neither guarded nor defensive. In a room full of speakers, raised hands, and clashing arguments, he was the only point of stillness. There was no badge held up, no blood trailing from cheek to collar, no defiant stare, no calm, steady voice that once silenced an entire police station, just a man sitting there, quiet, unmistakable, and not forgotten. Ellis Monroe didn't need to speak. His presence alone reaffirmed what the entire system was trying to rebuild: trust. Not through power, but through unshaken integrity, even when it has been wounded to its core. They say he never lost faith in justice, even after seeing it buried, distorted, and weaponized against the very people it was meant to protect. And for that reason, he never needed to raise his voice, never needed to push back. He only needed to show up in the exact place where voices had gone unheard for too long. Sitting there among those debating the future, he became a living memory of everything that had gone wrong, and proof that silence is not always surrender, but sometimes the final act of dignity. In that moment, no one asked him anything more. The meeting continued, but this time, no one spoke too loudly, and no argument passed without someone glancing toward the back of the room, toward the man who was once treated as a nobody, forced to hold up a badge just to prove he deserved to live, and who now stood for the opposite. When true justice exists, no one needs to hold anything up. They only need to keep the faith and make space for people like him to exist quietly and fully. The story of Ellis Monroe didn't begin with a justice campaign, nor did it originate in a legal forum. It began in a cold alley where a man in torn clothes, blood running down his face, was dragged up by two officers who thought they were arresting a nobody. Logan Fry and Darren Whitlow saw nothing but tattered clothes and dark skin. They didn't recognize the direct, silent gaze, nor did they understand the first thing he said to them: "I hope you turned your camera on." That mistake, of appearance, of prejudice, of the belief that authority permits anything, pulled the entire Dorchester system into a spiral it couldn't escape, because the man they beat, recorded, and mocked was the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, a man who once swore to uphold justice even when it did not protect him. From a leaked video, public outcry exploded. From a wave of hashtags, thousands of questions emerged. If a black judge could be beaten like that, then who was truly safe? From Ellis's silence, a wave of awakening spread across the state, not sparked by angry calls to action, but by the unyielding gaze in a photo where his blood-stained ID badge was circled in red. Logan was banned from practicing, Whitlow lost his job, and cases of wrongful arrest began to be reopened. But beyond the punishments, the story went further, cutting into the roots of a society long used to judging people by badges, by clothing, by unconscious bias. Ellis Monroe didn't speak often. He never used the incident to amplify his own voice, let alone leverage it for greater power. He simply showed up where silence was needed most, from a closed-door forum with a single empty chair in the center to a private session with young officers where he asked what they first thought when they saw someone in rags. His story became mandatory reading in training programs, not because he was a victim, but because he survived without losing faith in justice, even when it was buried beneath everything. and he never had to raise his voice to be heard, because he knew that if a system needs someone to shout to earn respect, then it was broken from the start. The lesson from Ellis didn't lie in titles, nor in retaliation. It lay in the ability to remain whole through layers of bias, to walk out of the role of victim without erasing the wounds. It lay in the ability to cause others to change, not through pressure, but through the right question and an unforgettable presence. And maybe the deepest lesson is this: when justice becomes something no one has to prove, that's when a society truly begins to heal. Not for one person, but for all the names that were never remembered.